The stagecoach rolled into Harlan Creek on a Tuesday morning in the late spring of 1878, and every soul on the main street stopped walking the moment Kate Grayson stepped down from it. Because a woman traveling alone with nothing but a battered leather satchel and a calm expression in a town that had not seen a stranger in 3 months was either very brave or very foolish. And the people of Harlan Creek had already decided which one she was before she even touched the ground. Kate steadied herself on the dusty planked sidewalk and looked up and down the length of the town with the careful, measured gaze of someone who had learned to take stock of a place before it had a chance to take stock of her. Harlan Creek, Nevada Territory, was not a beautiful town by any measure. It sat at the base of a long, flat basin between two ridges of brown and rust-colored rock, and the buildings that lined its single main street were the color of old bone, bleached pale by a sun that seemed to have a personal grudge against everything it touched. There was a general store, a livery stable, a small church with a bell that hung crooked, a land office, a saloon called the Red Spur, and a scattering of homes fanning out behind the commercial face of things like the town was trying to hide what it really was from the road. Kate was 27 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned at the nape of her neck, and she had gray eyes that were neither soft nor hard but somewhere in the middle. The eyes of a woman who had seen enough of the world to know it was complicated, but had not yet let that knowledge make her cynical. She wore a plain brown traveling dress that was clean despite the 4 days she had spent on the stagecoach, and she carried herself with a straight-backed confidence that was not arrogance, but rather the posture of someone who had learned early that the world treated you approximately as well as you expected it to treat you. She had come to Harlan Creek because she had answered an advertisement in a Reno newspaper seeking a schoolteacher for a growing mining community. The advertisement had been placed by a man named Alderman Prescott, who served as both the mayor of Harlan Creek and the owner of the general store, and who had written back to Kate with considerable enthusiasm after reviewing her letters of reference from the school in Sacramento, where she had taught for the previous 4 years. He had told her the position was hers. He had told her to come at her earliest convenience. He had not mentioned, in any of his 3 letters, that Harlan Creek also had a policy, informal but ironclad, of not employing women who were not from established local families, a policy that had been instituted not by any written law but by the collective agreement of a handful of men who liked things a certain way and had enough influence in the town to keep them that way. She had not known about any of this when she climbed down from the stagecoach. She would know all of it within the hour. Alderman Prescott was a short man with a wide mustache, and the particular kind of discomfort in his expression that a person gets when they have made a promise they are now trying to figure out how to break without looking like they are breaking it. He met her on the sidewalk in front of his store and shook her hand quickly, as though he did not want anyone to see him doing it too warmly, and then he pulled her inside and spoke to her in a low, rapid voice about how things had changed since his advertisement, how the town council had met and decided they would prefer a local teacher, how he was sorry for the inconvenience, how he would be happy to put her on the next stagecoach out of town, which came through on Thursday morning. Kate listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she asked him, very quietly, whether the schoolchildren of Harlan Creek had a teacher. He said no, not at present. She asked him whether she had her references and her certification and whether those documents were satisfactory. He said they were more than satisfactory. She asked him whether the position was still open. He cleared his throat. He looked at the window. He said it was complicated. She told him she would find lodging for the night and that she would like to speak with the full town council in the morning, not because she was demanding anything, but because she thought she deserved the courtesy of being turned down by the people who had actually made the decision rather than by a messenger. Then she picked up her satchel, thanked him for his time, and walked back out into the sun. This, as it turned out, was when the real trouble began. The men who ran Harlan Creek were not cruel in the way that truly wicked men are cruel. They were small men with small fears, and what they feared about Kate Grayson was not anything specific she had done, but rather what she represented, which was a woman from outside coming in to do something they had decided women from outside should not do. There was also the matter of a man named Frank Dole, who was the richest man in the county by a considerable margin, who owned most of the silver claims in the surrounding hills, and who had a niece named Harriet that he had been angling to install as the town's schoolteacher for the better part of a year. Harriet was 19 and had a pleasant face and very little actual knowledge of how to run a classroom, but she was Frank Dole's niece, and in Harlan Creek in 1878, that counted for considerably more than a teaching certificate from a reputable institution. By noon, word had spread through the town with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve, which is to say instantly, and with considerable embellishment. Kate had heard 3 versions of her own arrival by the time she sat down in the small dining room of the boarding house, run by a widow named Mrs. Aldercott, who served her a bowl of beef stew and a piece of cornbread with the tight-lipped efficiency of a woman who had opinions she had decided not to share. The versions ranged from the nearly accurate to the wildly fantastical, and in one of them Kate had apparently been accompanied by a man who did not exist, which she found more amusing than anything else. What was not amusing was what happened at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when Frank Dole himself walked into Mrs. Aldercott's boarding house with 2 of his ranch hands and a piece of paper that he said was an ordinance permitting the town to remove any itinerant person who could not demonstrate means of lawful employment. And since Kate no longer had a teaching position, he said, she qualified as itinerant, and he would appreciate it if she would collect her things. Kate looked at the paper. She looked at Frank Dole. She looked at the 2 ranch hands who had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. She said, I would like to see that ordinance in the original town charter before I go anywhere. Frank Dole's face did something complicated. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, with a silver watch chain that caught the light and silver hair that was thick and well kept, and he was used to people doing what he said when he said it. He was not used to a woman with a quiet voice and steady gray eyes asking to see the original charter. He said the charter was at the land office and she was welcome to look at it on her way out of town. She said she would go look at it right now if he did not mind. He minded. But he could not quite say so without admitting that the ordinance did not, in fact, exist in the charter in the form he had described it. And so the afternoon dissolved into a tense and unpleasant standoff in which Kate walked to the land office, read every page of the town charter that was available, found no such ordinance, returned to the boarding house, set her satchel back down in the room she had rented, and told Mrs. Aldercott that she would be staying at least through Thursday. Mrs. Aldercott, to her credit, simply nodded and said supper was at 6, but Frank Dole was not finished. That evening, he held court at the Red Spur Saloon and held a conversation with the mayor and 4 members of the town council that was not exactly a formal meeting, but arrived at the same conclusions a formal meeting would have reached, the main conclusion being that Kate Grayson needed to leave Harlan Creek before nightfall on Wednesday. Not because of any legal mechanism that could actually be made to hold, but because Frank Dole was prepared to make things very uncomfortable for anyone who helped her, which in a town where he held the notes on 3 businesses and employed a quarter of the working men, was not an idle threat. By Wednesday morning, Mrs. Aldercott had informed Kate, with genuine regret in her eyes even if she could not quite manage it in her voice, that she was afraid she would not be able to continue to provide lodging after that day. The dining room of the boarding house was suddenly unavailable for Kate's use. The general store, when she walked in to purchase a few supplies, had Prescott's son at the counter who told her very nervously that they were out of everything she asked for, even things she could see clearly on the shelves behind him. The church, when she knocked on the door hoping to speak with the minister, turned out to be locked in the middle of the morning for reasons that the minister's wife explained with considerable difficulty and no eye contact. Kate sat down on a bench outside the church and looked at the street. It was 10 in the morning on a Wednesday in late May, and the sky was the particular deep blue that the desert sky achieves when the air is very clear, and there is no cloud for 100 miles in any direction. And it was so beautiful it almost hurt to look at, and she was trying very hard not to let the fact that she was running out of options make her hands shake. She would not cry here. She had learned that much. You did not let them see you shake. She was still sitting there when the sound of boots on the planked walk made her look up, and she saw a man she had not seen before, which was notable because she had been cataloging the faces of Harlan Creek since her arrival with the particular attention of someone who had spent her life learning which faces were safe. He was tall, not extremely so but enough that he stood a few inches above most of the other men she had seen, with broad, work-squared shoulders and dark hair that was sun-streaked and needed cutting. He wore plain clothes, a work shirt, dark trousers, boots that were dusty and well-used, and a gun belt that he wore with the casual ease of someone who had been wearing it for a very long time. He had a face that was lean and tanned and somewhat angular, with dark eyes that had a directness to them that was not unfriendly, but was very much the eyes of someone who said what he meant and expected the same in return. He was 32 years old, though she did not know that yet. She would learn it later, when she knew enough about him to want to know such things. He looked at her sitting on the bench and he stopped. Not rudely, not staring, but with the simple straightforwardness of a man who noticed something and dealt with it rather than walking past it. He said, "You are the school teacher." It was not a question. She said, "I am attempting to be." He said, "I heard what Dole is doing." He paused. "My name is Cecil Hunter. I have a spread about a mile east of town. I ranch cattle mostly, and I do some silver assaying on the side for the smaller claim holders." He looked down the street toward the red spur and then back at her. "I am not friends with Frank Dole." She studied him for a moment. "Is that relevant?" "I thought it might be relevant to you," he said, without any particular offense. She considered this. "Kate Grayson," she said, and stood up from the bench and offered her hand because she had been raised to do so and she was not going to stop on account of geography. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief and he let go as soon as was natural, which she noted. He said, "Do you have a place to stay tonight?" she said. "That is something I am working on." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have a spare room in my house. My housekeeper, Mrs. Vargas, lives in the smaller house on the property. It would be proper enough, and I am not offering charity. I am offering a room in exchange for whatever the boarding house was charging, because I am not a man who needs to give handouts, and I do not expect you would want to receive one." She looked at him with those steady gray eyes and tried to figure out what kind of man made this kind of offer to a stranger. She had known enough men in her 27 years to know they generally fell into a small number of categories, and she was trying to determine which category Cecil Hunter belonged to. What she found, after several seconds of looking, was that she could not quite place him, and that was unusual enough to be interesting. She said, "Why would you do that, given what you just told me about Dole's influence in this town?" He said, "Because a person ought to have somewhere to sleep, and because the last time I let this town pressure me into doing something I knew was wrong, I did not sleep well for 6 months. He paused. "I am not interested in repeating that experience." She asked him what that had been. He said, "There was a Chinese miner named Chen Wei who worked a claim in the Eastern Ridge. 2 years ago, the town decided they did not want Chinese workers in the area. A group of men ran him off his claim, and I stood on my porch and watched it happen because I told myself it was not my business. Chen Wei lost everything. His claim was absorbed by Dole's operation the following month." He looked at her steadily. "It was my business. I just did not act like it was." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right, Mr. Hunter, I will take the room." The conversation was that simple and that complicated at once, and neither of them said anything more about it as he led her back to where he had tied his horse at the rail outside the general store, and helped load her satchel into the saddle bag, and they walked the mile east out of town together through the warming morning air, with the desert stretching out around them in all its spare and unforgiving beauty. Cecil Hunter's property was not large by the standards of the great cattle operations in the territory, but it was solid and well kept in the way that things are kept when the person who owns them is neither proud nor careless but simply practical. The main house was a square, single-story structure built from both wood and adobe brick, with a deep covered porch running across the front and a kitchen garden along the south side that was clearly tended with some attention, because the rows were straight and the plants were healthy. There was a barn and a corral with 6 horses, and a smaller structure set back from the main house that was the housekeeper's quarters. 3 men were working in the near pasture, ranch hands who looked up briefly at the sound of approaching footsteps and then returned to their work. Mrs. Vargas appeared on the porch of her small house before they had crossed the yard. She was a stout Mexican woman somewhere in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and very dark, very observant eyes, and she looked at Kate with the same calibrating attention that Kate had given Cecil on the bench outside the church, which Kate recognized and appreciated. She spoke to Cecil briefly in a mixture of Spanish and English, which he answered in kind, and then she looked at Kate and said in careful English, "You will want to wash before supper. I will bring water." The spare room in Cecil's house was small and simply furnished, with a narrow bed with a quilt that had been made by someone who knew what they were doing, a washstand, a small writing desk, and a window that looked east toward the ridge and caught the afternoon light in a way that made the bare wall opposite it glow gold. Kate stood in the middle of it and breathed. It was the first moment since the stagecoach had stopped in Harlan Creek that she had been alone and not performing composure for an audience, and she let herself feel, very briefly, how tired she was. Not tired of traveling, tired of being told she should not be somewhere she had every right to be. She washed her face and hands and put her things away in the small dresser beside the bed, and by the time she had finished the sun was getting long and golden and Mrs. Vargas was rattling pots in the kitchen that was part of the main house, and Kate followed the smell of cooking to find Cecil already at the table with a map spread in front of him that appeared to be a survey of the Eastern Ridge claims. He folded it up when she came in, not because he was hiding it but because it was simply courtesy, and she thought that was a good sign. He was not a man who talked for the sake of filling silence. Over supper, which was beans and cornbread and salt pork, and some dried apple that Mrs. Vargas had stewed into a compote that was surprisingly good, they had a conversation that moved slowly and carefully the way rivers move in dry country, finding the path of least resistance not out of timidity but out of intelligence. He asked her about her teaching experience. She told him about Sacramento, about the school there and the children she had taught, about the way children learned differently from one another, and how figuring out which method worked for which child was the part of the work she loved most. He listened to all of this with complete attention, which she noticed because complete attention is rarer than people pretend it is. When she finished, he said, "The children in this town need a teacher. There are 14 of them school age, and the last teacher left 8 months ago when his wife took ill and they went back to Ohio." She said, "I know, that is why I am here." He said, "Dole will try to make it hard for you tomorrow." She said, "He already has." He said, "You are planning to stay." She said, "I am planning to speak with the council in the morning and present my case, and after that I will see." He looked at her for a moment with those direct dark eyes. "What kind of case are you planning to make?" she said. "The straightforward kind, that I am qualified, that the position is open, that the children need teaching, that none of the objections to my presence here are legal or rational." She paused. "And that if the town council declines me on grounds that are neither legal nor rational, I intend to write to the territorial superintendent of education, because I happen to know that Harlan Creek is required to maintain a school in order to retain its charter status. And without a teacher there is no school. And without a school there is no charter status. And without charter status Alderman Prescott loses his land office rights." Cecil Hunter looked at her for a long enough moment that she had time to wonder whether she had miscalculated something. Then the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was the immediate ancestor of one. He said, "You researched all of that before you came," she said. "I researched all of that on the road from Reno after I realized the letters had been a little too enthusiastic." He said, "You suspected there was going to be trouble." She said, "I suspected there was going to be some amount of resistance. Women often encounter some amount of resistance. I have learned to plan for it rather than be surprised by it." He said, "That is a very practical philosophy." She said, "Practicality has kept me employed and housed for 9 years. I am a great believer in it." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "The council meets at 9 in the morning at the land office. I know this because I am technically a member of it, though I have not attended in several months." She said, "Why not?" He said, "Because the last 3 meetings were all about ways to make things easier for Frank Dole, and I found I had better uses for my time." He paused, "But I will attend tomorrow." She looked at him carefully. "You do not need to do that." He said, "I know." He picked up his coffee cup and looked at the surface of it. "I am going to do it anyway." There was something in the simple plainness of how he said it that settled into her chest like warmth, and she decided it was reasonable gratitude rather than anything more complicated. And she went to bed that night thinking about her presentation to the council, and not at all about the way the lamplight had looked on Cecil Hunter's face when he said he was going to do it anyway. She slept better than she had in 4 days. The town council meeting the next morning was everything she had expected, and a few things she had not. Frank Dole was there, which was not surprising since he was not a council member but had never let that stop him before. Alderman Prescott was there, looking like a man trying to please too many people at once, which was the expression he apparently always wore. There were 4 other men whose names she learned from Cecil as they walked into town. Harvey Bunch, who ran the livery stable; James Ord, who was a prosperous claim holder; Robert Neely, who was the town's part-time deputy and full-time bookkeeper; and a man named Thomas Fitch who had come out from Missouri 5 years ago and set himself up as the closest thing Harlan Creek had to a lawyer. Cecil walked into the land office beside her and took a seat, and the room rearranged itself around this fact like water around a stone. She noticed it. The men on the council noticed it. Frank Dole noticed it most of all, and his jaw set in a particular way that told her he had not expected this development. She presented her case exactly as she had described to Cecil. She was methodical and clear, and she did not raise her voice or show emotion except in the places where she intended to, which was when she talked about the 14 school-age children who had not had a teacher for 8 months. She put the question to them plainly. What exactly were their legitimate objections to her filling the position for which she had been advertised and invited? The room did a great deal of throat clearing and shifting of weight. Frank Dole said that the town preferred a local applicant. Kate asked whether there was a local applicant currently available. He said his niece Harriet would be available by summer. Kate asked whether the children were supposed to wait until summer without schooling, because a theoretically available future applicant was preferred over a qualified and present one. Thomas Fitch, the lawyer, had been looking increasingly uncomfortable since about the middle of Kate's presentation, and now he said, very carefully, that he thought they should consider the superintendent's requirements regarding charter status, which he happened to know rather well, and that he would not want to advise the council to take any action that compromised that status. This produced a very different quality of silence in the room. Cecil said, from his chair, in a voice that was calm and carried the particular weight of a man who chose his words because they mattered and not because he liked the sound of them, "I move to confirm Miss Grayson's appointment as Harlan Creek schoolteacher on the terms originally proposed by the council's advertisement." James Ord, the claim holder, seconded it before anyone else had time to react, either because he genuinely thought it was right or because he wanted to stay on the good side of a man who assayed silver claims and whose judgment he trusted, or both. Frank Dole said Cecil's name once, in a tone that was meant to be a warning. Cecil looked at him with perfect steadiness and said, "The motion is on the table, Frank." The vote was 4-2, with Prescott eventually voting in favor because he could see which way it was going and he preferred to be on the winning side. Dole sat in the corner with his arms crossed and did not speak again, which was not the same as admitting defeat, but was the closest he was going to come to it in a public room. Kate sat very still throughout this and did not allow herself to exhale until they were back on the street in the open air, where she breathed in slowly and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since Tuesday morning. Cecil was beside her. He said, "The schoolhouse is on Cedar Street, which is the second street back from the main. It needs some work, but the structure is sound. Mrs. Vargas knows where the school supplies are stored, I believe, since she helped the last teacher with some cataloging before he left." She looked at him. "You knew where the supplies were stored," he said. "I may have checked on that this morning before we left," she said. Cecil. It was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt it as a small, distinct thing, like a pebble dropped in still water. "Thank you. I do not just mean for today." He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted in the way that feelings shift when they have been careful and contained and suddenly have more space than they expected. He said, "You would have managed without me," she said. "Yes, but I did not have to." He nodded once and looked away down the street, and she let him have the moment because she thought he was not a man who was used to being thanked and was working out where to put it. The next 3 weeks were the happiest in recent memory for Kate Grayson, which surprised her because they were also some of the hardest working. The schoolhouse on Cedar Street was, as Cecil had said, structurally sound but in need of attention. The windows needed caulking against the desert wind. The floor needed sweeping of a winter's worth of dust. The shelves needed organizing, and the yard needed clearing of the scrubby brush that had grown up around the building's perimeter. Kate threw herself into all of this with an energy that came partly from purpose and partly from the very particular relief of having a battle won and work to do with the victory. The children began arriving on the first Monday morning. They came in 2s and 3s, some sent by parents who were cautiously hopeful, some sent by parents who were still skeptical, and 3 came entirely on their own initiative, because word had gotten out that the new teacher had managed to stand up to Frank Dole in a room full of men and come out with what she came for, and that was worth seeing up close. They ranged in age from 6 to 14, and they were a varied collection of children from mining families and ranching families and the families of the small business owners in town, and they were, nearly without exception, behind where they should have been in their education, not because they were not intelligent, but because 8 months without schooling will do that to any child. Kate loved them immediately and comprehensively. She loved the 6-year-old named Robbie Bunch, the livery stable owner's son, who could barely sit still for 5 minutes but had a startling mathematical intuition. She loved the 12-year-old Mei Ling, daughter of one of the few Chinese families remaining in the area after the troubles of 2 years ago, who read English with perfect fluency, but wrote it with a hesitant uncertainty that Kate recognized as the residue of being told one was not entirely welcome. She loved the 14-year-old James Cord, who had the serious, careful manner of a boy who planned to do something important with his life and was looking for the tools to do it. She worked from early morning until late afternoon most days. She walked the mile to and from Cecil's property with a comfortable rhythm that became part of her day in the way that very good things become part of a day, quietly and completely. Cecil gave her the horse. He did not announce this. On the second Friday of her teaching, she came out to begin the walk to the schoolhouse in the morning and found a small, even-tempered bay mare saddled and tied to the porch post with a note in Cecil's handwriting that said simply, "Her name is Dulce. She is sensible and she knows the road. Mrs. Vargas, who had come out of her small house and was watching from the doorway, said, "He has been deciding about that horse for a week." Kate looked at Dulce, who looked back at her with the patient expression of a sensible horse. She looked at Mrs. Vargas. Mrs. Vargas said, "He is not a man who does things without thinking them through." Kate folded the note carefully and put it in her pocket. She said, "No, I can see that." She thanked Cecil at supper that evening. He was brief and practical about accepting the thanks, saying that the walk was too long in summer heat and that Dulce needed the exercise. Kate did not press him on it. But she noticed that when she described something funny Robbie Bunch had done that day involving a multiplication problem and a chicken that had wandered into the schoolhouse, Cecil's expression opened in a way she had not seen before, genuine and unguarded, and he laughed, and it was a good laugh, the kind that came from the chest and meant something. They had begun, without either of them deciding to, having supper together every evening. It had started because Mrs. Vargas cooked for the household, and it was simply the most logical thing for Kate to eat at the table where the food was served. But it had continued past logic into something else, into a shared space in the day that both of them found themselves looking toward during the hours that preceded it. Cecil told her, over the course of those suppers, about himself in the gradual and careful way that private people reveal themselves, in pieces, in the context of other topics, in passing mentions that accumulated into a portrait. He had come to Nevada Territory from Missouri 10 years ago, at 22, with enough money to buy a small claim and enough stubbornness to turn it into a cattle operation when the claim did not yield what he had hoped. He had a brother in St. Louis, whom he corresponded with but had not seen in 4 years. He had been briefly engaged, at 26, to a woman named Margaret who had decided, very reasonably, that she did not want to live a mile from a small desert town, and had gone back to Missouri and married a banker, and he bore her no ill will and wished her well. He had lived alone on this property for the past 6 years with the horses and the cattle and the 3 ranch hands and Mrs. Vargas, and he had not, until approximately 17 days ago, particularly felt the absence of someone to talk to at supper, because he had not known what that felt like. He did not say this last part in so many words, but Kate heard it. She told him in return about her own life, which had been shaped largely by the fact that both her parents had died of typhoid fever when she was 15, and she had been raised by an aunt in Sacramento who was a kind woman but a very practical one, who had decided early that Kate was smart and would need to make her own way, and had educated her accordingly. She told him about the school in Sacramento and the principal there, a woman named Mrs. Abbott, who had been the first person in Kate's life to tell her that her intelligence was an asset rather than an inconvenience. She told him about the other teacher at the school, a young man named Daniel Reeve, who had asked her to marry him when she was 23, and whom she had declined because she liked him very much but did not love him, and she had thought loving someone was something that should be there if you were going to marry them. Cecil said, very quietly, "That seems right," she said. "I used to wonder if I was too particular about it." He said, "I do not think you were." The evenings grew longer as May stretched into June, and the light lasted past 8 o'clock, golden and warm, and spreading across the desert in a way that made the world look like a painting of itself. After supper, they sometimes sat on the front porch, which had 2 chairs and a view of the eastern ridge, and talked, or were quiet in approximately equal measure, and both the talking and the quiet were comfortable in a way that Kate had not experienced with many people. She was aware, with the particular awareness that a person has when something is happening that they are both noticing and not quite ready to name, that she was falling in love with Cecil Hunter. She noted this the way you note the weather, with interest and a sense that you cannot exactly control it, but it would be useful to know about it. She was not frightened of it. She was, if anything, curious about it because it felt different from what she had expected love to feel like. She had expected something dramatic and consuming because that was how it was described in the novels she had read. This was not that. This was quieter and more solid, like the way a good building feels when you are standing in it during a windstorm, not exciting but deeply and thoroughly real. She did not know whether Cecil felt the same. She thought he might. There were moments, a look across the supper table, the way he had handed her the bridle for Dulce one morning and let his hand rest for half a second against hers before stepping back, the way he listened to her talk, leaning slightly forward as though every word she said was a thing worth catching, that suggested something was there. But Cecil Hunter was not a man who moved quickly with things that mattered, and she respected that about him, and she was patient. Frank Dole was not patient, and he was not finished. He had spent the 3 weeks since the council meeting doing the thing that petty, powerful men do when they lose a public battle, which is to make things difficult in small and deniable ways. A fence between his grazing land and Cecil's property line had been moved, requiring a survey. One of Cecil's ranch hands, a young man named Pete Corley, had been offered triple his salary to come work for Dole's operation, and to his credit Pete had declined, but the offer had been made in a way that made clear Dole was picking at the edges of Cecil's life methodically. 2 of the parents who had enrolled children in Kate's school had been visited by Dole's foreman with mentions of various small pressures related to grazing rights and water access, and 2 children had missed a week of school before Kate had gone herself to speak with both families and explained, calmly and clearly, that their children's education was not a bargaining chip in anyone's economic dispute. The genuine crisis came on a Thursday afternoon in the 3rd week of June, when a man named Cray Hollies rode into Harlan Creek. Cray Hollies was from Texas, originally. He was a man in his mid-30s who had been a cattle driver and then a hired hand of various kinds, and had drifted into the territory 3 years ago, and had been doing odd jobs of the sort that were not quite legal but were not quite provable either. He had a connection to Frank Dole that most people in town knew about in a general way but could not specifically articulate, the kind of connection that is maintained through cash payments and the mutual pretense that everyone knows about. He had been away from Harlan Creek for several months, and his return, Kate would later learn, had been arranged. She did not know any of this on Thursday afternoon. She was still at the schoolhouse, helping Mei Ling with a composition, when Mrs. Vargas appeared at the schoolhouse door, breathing harder than her usual dignity permitted, and said that Kate needed to come back to the property immediately. Kate told the children to pack up and headed back. Cray Hollies was on the road between town and Cecil's property when she came along on Dulce, and he pulled his horse across the road in a way that was clearly not accidental, and told her that a woman traveling alone on the eastern road without a proper escort was the kind of thing that gave decent people concern, and that he would be happy to turn her around and see her back to town, where he had heard she had been causing trouble for good people. Kate held Dulce steady. The horse, being sensible, did not spook. Kate said, in the same tone she used when a child in her classroom was testing limits, "Get out of my road, please." Hollies grinned. He was not a frightening man in the way that genuinely dangerous men are frightening, because he lacked the competence. He was a bully, and bullies were familiar to Kate, and she had found over the years that they generally responded to the same thing, which was the complete and unbluffable refusal to be impressed by them. She said, "I am going to count to 3, and then I am going to ride around you, and if you attempt to stop me, you will have committed a crime in front of Mrs. Carmen Vargas, who is watching from the gate post 30 yards behind me and will be very pleased to testify to it." Hollies looked past her. Mrs. Vargas was indeed at the gate post. She was also holding, with a calm that was almost theatrical, a rifle that belonged to Cecil and that she had clearly known where to find. Hollies moved his horse out of the road. Kate rode through without looking at him again. Cecil was in the yard when she came through the gate. Mrs. Vargas came behind her and gave the rifle back to him with a brief remark in Spanish that made his jaw go tight. He looked at Kate and said, "Are you all right?" She said, "Yes." He was not particularly competent. He said that was Cray Holly's. He works for Dole, she said. I assumed something like that. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, this is not going to stop. Dole does not let things go. She said, I know. He said, Kate. He said her name with a weight to it that was different from how he had said it before, as though he had been holding it carefully for a while and was now setting it down deliberately. I need to say something to you that I would like you to hear as straightforwardly as I intend it. She looked at him. The afternoon sun was coming in sideways across the yard, and there was dust in the air from where the horses had been moving, and it hung in the light like gold powder, and she thought, without meaning to, that this was the kind of moment you remembered. He said, you have every right to be here. In this town, in this territory, in this property. You have every right to the work you are doing and to the life you are building. I'm not going to let anyone take that from you, she said. That is your right to say, but this is not entirely your problem to solve. He said, it is my problem because I am making it my problem, because you matter to me. He stopped. He looked at the dust in the air. He said, I did not expect to feel that way, but it is the case. She stood still for a moment, just holding the feeling of that, because it was as simple and as enormous as a thing can be at the same time. She said, you matter to me too, Cecil. He looked at her then, directly and fully, and she thought she had never seen a man look more like himself than he did in that moment. He said, then we will figure out what to do about Dole together. She said, yes, we will. What they did about Dole began the next morning when Cecil rode into town and had a conversation with Thomas Fitch, the lawyer, that lasted most of an hour. Kate went to the land office and spoke with James Ord, who had seconded the council motion and who she had been careful to cultivate as a reasonable ally, and then she sat down and wrote 3 letters. One to the territorial superintendent of education, one to the county sheriff in the county seat, which was 25 miles south, and one to the Reno newspaper that had run the original advertisement, informing them that their advertisement had resulted in a position she had received, and then nearly had removed by means she thought the reading public might find instructive. The letter to the newspaper was perhaps the most effective of the 3. A journalist named William Barry happened to be passing through the county seat on his way to a silver mine story, and received it, and he arrived in Harlan Creek 4 days later with a notebook and a camera box, and an appetite for exactly the kind of story that Kate's letter had described. Frank Dole did not want his name in a Reno newspaper in association with the removal of a female schoolteacher. He did not want the territorial superintendent looking into Harlan Creek's charter compliance. He did not want the county sheriff, who was not under his influence and was in fact rather tiresome about legal procedure, coming to investigate the movement of a fence line or the actions of Cray Hollies on a public road. He also, Kate would later learn, did not want Cecil Hunter as an active enemy rather than a passive nuisance, because Cecil Hunter had been in Nevada territory for 10 years and knew every serious silver claim holder in the region, and his word on the quality of an assay and the reliability of a man's operation carried weight that Dole could not simply buy. The combination of these pressures over the course of the next 2 weeks produced a slow and graceless retreat on Dole's part. Hollies disappeared from the area. The fence line was surveyed and corrected. The parents of the 2 children who had been pressured received, through intermediaries, the suggestion that the pressure was no longer being applied. Harriet, Dole's niece, was quietly enrolled in a teacher's college in Carson City, which was perhaps the best outcome for everyone, including Harriet, who turned out to have no strong feelings about teaching and a genuine interest in bookkeeping. William Barry's article ran in the Reno newspaper in the 3rd week of June and was read by approximately nobody in Harlan Creek, but was read by several people in Carson City and at least one person at the Territorial Education Office. And the combined effect was the distinct and useful one of making Harlan Creek a place that official eyes had recently fallen upon. This turned out to be good for the town in ways that went beyond Kate's employment, as it prompted an inspection of the land records that caught two minor irregularities in Prescott's land office administration that he was subsequently required to correct, which produced in Prescott a complicated mixture of resentment toward Dole for having caused the situation and a reluctant respect for Kate Grayson, who had refused to quietly go away and had thus, inadvertently, cleaned up his books. On the last Saturday of June, Cecil asked Kate if she would like to ride with him to see the Eastern Ridge. He said it in the way he said practical things, as though it were simply a plan he had made, but his hands moved slightly when he said it, a small and uncharacteristic gesture that she recognized as something being slightly more nervous than it appeared. She said she would like that very much. They rode out in the early morning when the air still had some of the cool of the night in it, and the light was horizontal and amber across the desert floor. Cecil knew the land the way people know things they have moved through thousands of times in different moods and weathers, and he pointed out things as they went. The place in the dry creek bed where water surfaced after winter rains, the particular rock formation that looked one way at sunrise and completely different at sunset, the single pinyon pine that stood on a shelf of rock about halfway up the eastern ridge, ancient and stubborn and magnificent. They climbed partway up the ridge on a trail that the horses navigated with practiced ease, and reached a place where the rock opened out into a narrow shelf with a view of the whole basin. And they stopped there and got down from the horses and stood at the edge of the shelf and looked at the world below them. And it was the kind of view that makes a person feel how large and how brief everything is. The desert rolling out in all directions, the pale ribbon of the main road threading through the town, the silver thread of the creek to the south, the mountains in the distance blue and enormous. Cecil said after a while, "I want to ask you something." She said, "All right." He said, "Are you planning to stay in Harlan Creek long term?" She thought about it honestly, which she always did rather than saying what was easiest. She said, 6 weeks ago I did not know anything about Harlan Creek except that it needed a teacher. Now I know the faces of 14 children, and I know the way the light changes on this ridge, and I know where Mrs. Vargas keeps the good coffee and how you take yours." She paused. "I think I am planning to stay." He was looking at the basin below them. He said, "I think I would like it if you stayed." She said, "Cecil." He looked at her. She said, "I think you should say what you mean." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I have been trying to say it carefully because I do not want to say it wrong." He turned to face her fully, and she thought again what she had thought on the day she first saw him, that his eyes were completely direct, and she had never seen him look like anything other than exactly what he was. He said, "I am 32 years old and I have lived alone for 6 years on that property, and I have been fine with that, or at least I thought I was, until about 6 weeks ago, and now I understand that fine is a very different thing from good." He paused. "You are the best part of every day. I want you to know that." The shelf of rock and the pinyon pine and the whole enormous basin below them held still, as though the world had paused to listen. She stepped closer to him, because the distance between them suddenly seemed unnecessary, and she reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, and he closed his eyes for half a second in the way a person does when something arrives that they did not know they needed but turns out to be the most essential thing. She said, "Cecil Hunter. I came to Harlan Creek to teach school, and I have found that I have also found you, and I think those two things together are more than I knew to ask for." He opened his eyes. He said, "I would like to court you." "Properly, if you are agreeable." She said, "I am agreeable," he said, "and I would like to eventually, in due time, ask you to marry me. I am not asking now because that would be rushing, and I am not a man who rushes things that matter." She said, "I know that about you." He said, "But I wanted you to know the direction of my thinking." She said, "I am very glad you told me." He kissed her then, there on the rock shelf with the whole Nevada desert spread out below them, and the pinyon pine standing its ancient watch. And it was a kiss that was both tentative and absolutely certain. The way things are when they have been approached carefully but are, in themselves, without any doubt at all. They rode back in the warm morning light saying very little, but the silence between them had a completely different quality from all the silences before it. It was the silence of two people who had said the important things and could now rest in the fact that they had been said. July in Harlan Creek was hot in the thoroughgoing way of desert summer, the kind of heat that is not dramatic but simply enormous, pressing down on everything from a bleached white sky. Kate's schoolhouse had been moved to morning-only hours in deference to the heat, so the children arrived at 7 and left at noon before the full weight of the afternoon settled in, and Kate used the afternoons for planning, and for the conversations with parents that she had found were as important as anything that happened in the classroom itself. She and Cecil saw each other every day. This was perhaps not difficult, since she was living on his property, but they made of it something more intentional than proximity. He came to the schoolhouse on Fridays to help with any repairs or maintenance that had accumulated through the week, and she found she loved watching him work, the quiet competence of it, the way he applied himself to whatever needed doing without theatrics. She accompanied him twice to outlying claims where he was doing assay work, and sat nearby with a book while he worked, and they rode back together in the long summer evenings talking about everything and nothing. Mrs. Vargas watched all of this with the satisfaction of a woman who had spent 6 years hoping for exactly this development. She did not comment directly. She simply began cooking more elaborate suppers and occasionally sent Cecil to the schoolhouse with a bundle containing coffee and biscuits, which she addressed to Kate with the particular warmth of a woman who is deciding someone belongs. On a Sunday afternoon in late July, Kate was sitting on the porch writing letters, including her regular letter to her Sacramento aunt and a letter to her friend Clara in Reno, who had been following Kate's situation with great interest, when Frank Dole rode up the property road. She stood up slowly. Dole got down from his horse at the gate and came through with his hat in his hands, which was different enough from his previous manner that she paid attention to it. Cecil had come to the porch door behind her, drawn by the sound of a horse. Dole stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He was a large man who looked somewhat smaller standing with his hat in his hands. He said, "Miss Grayson, Hunter." He looked at Cecil. "I came to say I have been letting a personal matter make me act in ways that I am not proud of." He paused. He looked at his hat. "I have a temper about things not going the way I intend, and I let it go farther than it should have." Kate let the silence run for a moment before she spoke. She said, "I appreciate you saying so, Mr. Dole," he said. "I am not a man who apologizes easy. I want you to know this is genuine." Cecil said, "I will take it as such." Dole looked at Kate. He said, "You are a good teacher. I have heard enough from enough people in this town to know that, and I was wrong to try to remove you." He put his hat back on and looked up at the ridge. "Harriet wrote to me from Carson City that she likes the bookkeeping course very much." He actually smiled briefly. "She says she has a gift for numbers. I believe it." He said good day and got back on his horse and rode down the road toward town. Kate and Cecil stood on the porch and watched him go. Then Kate sat back down in her chair and Cecil sat in the other one, and she said, "Well," he said. "Well," she said, "I did not expect that." He said, "No, but some men eventually get there." He paused. "It helps when the alternative is being the villain in a newspaper story." She laughed and he smiled, and the afternoon settled back into its quiet warmth. She began in August to be quietly understood by the town as Cecil Hunter's intended. This understanding was communicated in the way such things were in small towns, through the pattern of who walked down the street with whom and who was seen at whose supper table on Sunday, and the way Cecil stood beside her at the general store counter, and did not stand beside her in the way men stand beside women they are merely acquainted with. Prescott, from behind his counter, once addressed her as Mrs. Hunter before correcting himself and going red. She did not mind. She was finding that she liked Harlan Creek more than she had expected to, now that the worst of its resistance had been overcome. She liked Mrs. Vargas with a thoroughness that felt like family. She liked James Ord and his wife Ellen, who invited her and Cecil to supper at the end of July, and turned out to be genuinely pleasant people who were relieved the Dole situation had resolved itself. She liked old Harvey Bunch, who had voted against her at the council meeting, and then showed up at the schoolhouse 3 weeks later with 2 new benches he had built in his shop, not saying anything about it, just carrying them in and setting them down and leaving. She even liked Prescott, a little, in the resigned way you like a man whose best quality is that he eventually tends to end up on the right side of things even if it takes him a while. She loved the children. She loved them more every week. She loved Robbie Bunch's mathematical wildness, and Mayling's careful, beautiful writing, and young James Cord's serious ambition, and the 6-year-old twins from the Sullivan mining family who wore identical expressions of determined mischief at all times. The schoolhouse, which she had spent a Saturday in late August painting the inside of with the help of 4 of the older students who had shown up voluntarily, smelled like fresh paint and chalk dust, and the particular hope of a place where learning was happening. Cecil asked her to marry him on the first Saturday in September. He did not make it a dramatic occasion, because he was not a dramatic man, and she would not have wanted it to be one. He asked her in the kitchen garden on the south side of the house, where she had been helping Mrs. Vargas stake up the tomato plants, which had gotten tall in the August heat, and where the evening air smelled of tomato leaves and warm earth and the faint clean smell of the desert sage coming from the open range beyond the fence. He said, "Kate, I told you in June that I would ask you in due time." He reached into his shirt pocket and took out a ring, a simple gold band with a small oval turquoise set in it that he had had made by the silversmith in the county seat. He said, "This is the due time." She looked at the ring and then at him, and she felt the fullness of the moment in her chest, that kind of happiness that is very still and very deep and does not need to make noise about itself. She said, "Yes, of course, yes." He put the ring on her hand and she looked at it in the evening light and thought that the turquoise was exactly right. The blue-green of it was exactly the color of the sky over the ridge on the mornings when the air was very clear, and she thought he had chosen it knowing that, which was the kind of knowing that accumulated between people who had been paying attention to each other. He kissed her in the tomato garden while Mrs. Vargas made a sound from the other side of the house that could have been surprise or could have been the long exhale of satisfaction, and they chose to interpret it as the latter. They were married in October. The ceremony was in the small church with the crooked bell, which the minister had come to terms with using for their wedding after some initial awkwardness that he eventually overcame, by concluding that a schoolteacher and a respected rancher were exactly the kind of people a church should be marrying. The ceremony was not large, because neither of them wanted large, but it was full of people who mattered. Mrs. Vargas in a blue dress that was her finest, James and Ellen Ord, Harvey Bunch and his wife Margaret, all 14 of Kate's students, who sat in the pews in their best clothes with varying degrees of fidgeting, Thomas Fitch, who had done more for Kate's cause than he had perhaps intended and seemed pleased with himself about it, Robbie Bunch's father, who had made 2 more benches for the church that were still smelling of new wood. Cecil stood at the front of the church and watched Kate walk down the aisle on her own, because her father was gone, and she had decided she did not need anyone to give her away. And the look on his face when she came toward him in her cream-colored dress with the autumn flowers she had found growing along the creek bank woven into her hair was the look of a man who was seeing exactly what he had hoped to see and was not trying to hide it. The minister said the words. Cecil and Kate said the words. The crooked bell was rung with enthusiasm by Robbie Bunch, who had been given the job for good behavior and treated it as the greatest responsibility he had ever received. They rode back to the property together in the mid-afternoon, husband and wife, through the golden October light, and the desert was doing the thing it did in fall when the heat backed off, and the air became cool and crystalline, and the distances became very clear, so that the mountains to the north and the south seemed close enough to touch. The winter was good. The schoolhouse closed for December and January, as it had always done, and Kate spent those months in the warmth of what had become entirely her home, learning the rhythms of the property through its cold-weather face, which was quieter and more internal. Cecil worked through winter on the fences and the equipment and the assay records that accumulated through the year, and in the evenings they read together or played cards or talked, and sometimes they simply sat by the fire with the sound of the wind off the ridge pressing against the walls, and Kate thought she had never been so thoroughly settled anywhere in her life. She wrote long letters to her aunt in Sacramento and her friend Clara in Reno, and Clara wrote back that she was coming to visit in spring, which she did, arriving on the Thursday stagecoach in early April with a trunk that contained more shoes than were strictly necessary for a week in the desert, and an irrepressible curiosity about Cecil that she discharged by asking him a great many questions over supper on her first night. And he answered all of them with the same direct patience he brought to everything, and Clara told Kate afterward, very quietly in the room they had put her in, that she completely understood, and that Cecil Hunter was one of the most genuinely good men she had ever encountered, and Kate said yes, she knew. Spring arrived in the desert with its brief and urgent beauty, the desert flowers coming up in the sandy soil between the sage, the light going long and warm again, the children coming back to school with the restless energy of children who have been cooped up indoors all winter. Kate stood in front of the schoolhouse on the first morning of the new school term and counted heads, and found that there were 17 children now rather than 14, because 3 new families had arrived in the area over the winter, 2 mining families and 1 family that had come to range cattle on land east of Cecil's property. She went home that evening glowing with the kind of satisfaction that good work produces. In May, she told Cecil that she was pregnant. She told him at supper simply because she did not know how to be otherwise about important things. She said, "I have been to see the doctor in the county seat. We are going to have a child in late November or early December." Cecil sat very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and the expression on his face was something she had never quite seen on him before, not the quiet steadiness that was his usual register, but something more open than that, something that was joy and fear, and something very deep that did not have a straightforward name. He said, "November or December," she said, "approximately." He said, "You are well. The doctor said everything is as it should be," she said. "Everything is as it should be." He said, "Good." He held her hand a little tighter. He said, "Good, Mrs. Vargas," was told that evening and responded by immediately beginning to plan in Spanish and English simultaneously, referencing recipes for strengthening broths and the location of baby blankets that she apparently kept in a trunk in her house for exactly this eventuality, and the importance of Kate not riding Dulce past her 6th month. This last point delivered with the finality of someone who was not offering an opinion, but issuing an instruction. Cecil said, that night when they were alone, "I want to be the kind of father my own father was not." He said it quietly and without self-pity, the way he said things that cost him something to say. "My father was a capable man, but he was not present. He was always somewhere else in his head, somewhere with the money he did not have or the land he wanted. I do not want to be somewhere else when I am here." She said, "I know you will not be." He said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because I have watched you for a year, because you are entirely present with everything you do. Because when I talk to you, you are actually listening, and when something needs attending to, you attend to it. That is the whole of parenting, Cecil, being there and paying attention." She paused. "You have been doing that your whole life. It will not be different with a child." He was quiet. Then he said, "You have a gift for saying the right thing." She said, "I teach 14 children. I have learned where the important words are." The summer of 1879 was the warmest and fullest in Kate's memory. She continued teaching through the end of July, by which point she was visibly pregnant and had received several opinions from the more traditional members of Harlan Creek's community that she ought to be home resting, all of which she acknowledged politely and disregarded. The children did not seem troubled by their teachers changing shape. Mei-ling asked her, with the directness that Kate had always loved in her, whether it was uncomfortable, and Kate said honestly that it was sometimes, and Mei-ling nodded as though this confirmed something she had already deduced. Young James Cord, who was 14 now and increasingly serious about his future, brought her a cushion for her chair one morning without explaining where it had come from. Cecil came to walk her home from the schoolhouse every day in those last weeks of the school term, not because she needed him to, but because he wanted to, and she let him because she had learned that with Cecil, accepting the care he offered was not diminishment, but the natural exchange between two people who had decided they belonged to each other. When the school term ended, she gave each of the 17 children a small gift, a book she had ordered from a catalog, modest and carefully chosen for each child according to what she knew about them, and Robbie Bunch, who was 7 now and had been maturing in ways that still surprised her, stood at the door on the last day and said very seriously that this was the best school he had ever attended, to which Kate pointed out that it was the only school he had ever attended, and he said yes. That was how he knew it was the best. August and September passed in a warm, slow, expectant rhythm. Cecil built a cradle in the barn, working on it in the evenings, and Kate sometimes came out and sat in the doorway on a low stool and watched him work by lantern light, and these were some of the best evenings she could remember. He was very careful with the cradle. He sanded it so smooth it was like touching still water, and he put a curved rocker on it that he calculated with a precision that Mrs. Vargas said was excessive, but that Kate understood completely. In October, they had a visitor. Cecil's brother came from St. Louis. His name was Daniel Hunter, and he was 2 years younger than Cecil, at 30, and bore enough resemblance to his brother that Kate recognized the family in him immediately. The same directness in the eyes and the same quality of stillness when he was thinking, though Daniel wore his differently, with more levity in it. He had come partly for the birth of his first nephew or niece, and partly because Cecil had written him a letter in June that described Kate in terms that had apparently made Daniel want to see for himself what kind of woman had changed the tone of his brother's letters so thoroughly. He said this to Kate on his second evening, with a directness that was very much the Hunter family manner. He said, Cecil's letters used to read like ranch reports, very thorough, very informative, very much like reading about weather rather than a person. He looked at her across the supper table. They changed about 6 weeks after you arrived. Kate looked at Cecil. Cecil was looking at the table, which she took as confirmation. She said, what did they sound like after? Daniel said, like someone who had remembered he was alive. Cecil said, without looking up, that is a very dramatic way to put it. Daniel said, it is an accurate way to put it. Kate looked at the ring on her hand and at the man across the table and at the brother who had come from St. Louis to meet her, and she thought about how life sometimes arranged itself in ways that were better than you had planned for, not because everything had been easy, but because the hard things had brought you somewhere worth being. The baby was born on the 6th of December, 1879. It was a boy. He arrived in the early morning hours, in the room with the window that looked east toward the ridge, with Mrs. Vargas present, and the doctor from the county seat who had ridden through the night in response to the message Cecil had sent when Kate's labor began. Cecil was in the room because there was no force in the territory that could have put him elsewhere, and he held Kate's hand through the long hours with a steadiness that she found both essential and remarkable, because she knew he was frightened, and he did not let the fear become a burden for her. The boy was born with a full head of dark hair and an expression of extreme displeasure at the interruption of whatever he had been doing before, which Kate found immediately endearing. He weighed, the doctor estimated, somewhere just above 8 pounds. He was entirely healthy. He cried with the conviction of someone who had an important point to make. Cecil held him first and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he looked at Kate, and she had not known it was possible for a human face to hold that much, but apparently it was. They named him William James Hunter. William for Cecil's grandfather, who had been the best of the Hunter men before them, and James for James Ord, whose seconding of the council motion had, in its small way, helped make all of this possible. Daniel Hunter, informed of his nephew's arrival by a note slid under the door of the spare room, sat down in the hallway and was heard by Mrs. Vargas to say something in a very quiet voice that ended in what might have been a laugh and might have been something else. By the time the sun came up over the eastern ridge on that December morning, William James Hunter was sleeping with the absolute commitment of a person who has done an enormous thing and needs to rest. And Kate was sleeping too, with Cecil sitting beside her in the chair he had brought in the previous evening and had not left, and the desert outside the window was washed pink and gold in the early light, and the ridge was clear, and the sky above it was the blue-green of turquoise. The school reopened in February of 1880 with 20 children. Word had spread in the surrounding area that the Harlan Creek school was run by a teacher worth attending, and 2 of the new children had ridden in from homestead families several miles out, which made Kate feel a pride in the work that she did not try to diminish or qualify. William came with her to the schoolhouse on the days when Mrs. Vargas could not stay with him, bundled in a basket that sat near Kate's desk, and the children treated him with a reverence usually reserved for small animals and very delicate things, taking turns looking in at him with an attention that Kate found useful, since it gave her a reliable way to reward good behavior. Cecil's cattle operation did well through the winter and into the spring of 1880. The herd had grown, and he had taken on a 4th ranch hand, a young man of 19 named Samuel Torres, whose family ranched to the south and who had come recommended by James Ord. Samuel was quiet and very good with the horses, and Cecil gave him more responsibility than he expected and found he was ready for it, which was the way Cecil did things with people, not testing them with small tasks but trusting them with real ones and being present to help when the size of the task was bigger than expected. Frank Dole, in the spring of 1880, sold 2 of his silver claims to a mining company from San Francisco and reduced his local operation considerably. He was not a broken man, but the period of the newspaper coverage and the official scrutiny had cost him more than the strictly financial, and the resistance he had put up had eventually exhausted itself against the fact of Kate and Cecil's establishment in the community. He attended the spring dance at the general store in April, which the whole town attended in the way of frontier communities that make their entertainments communal because there is no other kind, and he spoke with Kate for approximately 4 minutes in a way that was perfectly civil and contained. She felt a genuine if unspoken acknowledgement that things had been sorted. She told Cecil about it on the way home. He said, "Some men become better when they have fewer fights to win." She said, "I think that might be true of most men." He said, "It might be true of most people." The spring dance had been the first time Kate had danced in over a year, since the combination of a late pregnancy and winter, and a new baby had somewhat curtailed dancing opportunities. And she had danced with Cecil for 3 songs, and then with James Ord, and then with Daniel, who had extended his visit in a way that suggested he was finding Harlan Creek more interesting than he had expected, which Kate suspected had something to do with Ellen Ord's younger sister, a woman named Jane who had arrived for a winter visit and extended her stay with suspicious convenience. She mentioned this to Cecil, who said he had noticed and was not surprised, and that Daniel had always had good taste, and Kate said that was the nicest thing she had heard him say about his brother, and Cecil said he had a reputation to maintain and she should not spread it around. By the summer of 1880, Harlan Creek had grown. 2 new businesses had opened on the main street, a barber and a small dressmaker's shop run by a woman from Virginia City who had decided she preferred a quieter town. The church bell had been straightened. The school had 23 enrolled children. Alderman Prescott, who had finally made his peace with the course of events, had expanded his general store and was visibly less uncomfortable than he had been 2 years before, which Kate attributed partly to the cleaned-up land office records and partly to the simple relief of not being caught between Frank Dole and his own conscience anymore. William Hunter, at 8 months old, had learned to pull himself upright holding onto things, which Mrs. Vargas tracked with the precise attention of a scientist observing a critical experiment. He had Cecil's eyes and Kate's tendency to study things carefully before acting on them, which both parents found simultaneously recognizable and astonishing. On an evening in late August, Kate and Cecil sat on the porch the way they often did in the hour before dark, with William asleep inside and the ridge going purple in the last light and the sage smell coming cool off the desert. Cecil said, "Are you happy here?" She looked at him. She said, "What kind of question is that?" He said, "A genuine one." She said, "Yes, I am profoundly happy here, you know that." He said, "I know it, I like to hear it." She said, "Then I will tell you as often as you like." She leaned against his shoulder the way she had learned to do, the way that fit, and looked at the ridge. She said, "I came here with a satchel and a teaching certificate and a considerable amount of stubbornness, and I found this." He said, "You found it because you refused to leave when they told you to." She said, "You made it possible for me to stay." He said, "You would have found a way." She thought about it. She said, "Probably, but it would have been lonelier." He put his arm around her and they watched the ridge go from purple to gray to the first dark of night, and the stars came out in the high desert sky the way they always did, all at once, as though someone had struck a match to the whole vault of heaven, and the world was very large and very still and very close. The following spring, Kate was pregnant again. She told Cecil in May of 1881, in the kitchen garden where he had asked her to marry him, because she thought that was right. He had been tying up the tomato plants again, the garden having grown considerably since Mrs. Vargas had decided Kate was the sort of person who could be trusted to take an interest in it, and he stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He said, "November again, approximately," she said, "closer to December. We appear to have a preference." He pulled her toward him and held her there in the warm morning and the smell of tomato leaves and sage, and she felt his heartbeat against her cheek, steady and sure, the way it always was. He said into her hair, "I want 4." She pulled back enough to look at him. She said, "4," he said, "or whatever number you are willing to consider." She said, "I will consider 4. That seems like a reasonable aspiration." He kissed her forehead. "William needs someone to argue with." She laughed. She said, "He is not even a year old." He said, "Better to plan ahead." This baby, born in December of 1881 as predicted, was a girl. They named her Clara Margaret Hunter, Clara for Kate's friend in Reno who cried when she received the letter, and Margaret because Cecil had always thought his former intended, whatever had passed between them, had borne a name worth honoring in its own right, without any association to pain. Clara Margaret arrived with considerably less drama than her brother and considerably more hair, which she had apparently spent several months accumulating in preparation. She had Kate's auburn coloring and Cecil's stillness, and she looked at the world from her first moments with the particular expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they had been planning to arrive and is taking stock of whether it measures up. It measured up. William James, at just over 2 years old, was brought to see his sister by Mrs. Vargas, who held him up and let him look, and he regarded her for a long, serious moment, and then looked at Cecil and said, with great gravity, "Small." Cecil said, "You were small once." William appeared to find this unlikely. The school year of 1881 to 1882 was the most ambitious yet. Kate had 27 students now, ranging from 5 to 15, and she had written to the Territorial Education Office requesting a part-time assistant, which had been granted in the form of a stipend that she used to engage Mei Ling, who was now 15 and had turned out to be exceptional at mathematics, and at explaining things to the younger students with a patience and clarity that was genuinely gifted. Mei Ling spent 2 afternoons a week at the schoolhouse as a junior assistant, and Kate wrote about her in a letter to the superintendent with specific and detailed praise. She was, in some ways, her own best argument for what a school could do. Mei Ling had arrived at the schoolhouse 4 years ago with hesitant English and the particular uncertainty of a child who has been told she does not quite belong, and she was leaving it a young woman who read everything she could find and was corresponding with a cousin in San Francisco about the possibility of further education. And Kate thought, when she thought about Mei Ling, that this was what the work was for. In the spring of 1882, Daniel Hunter married Jane, the sister of Ellen Ord, in a ceremony at the Harlan Creek church, which brought him back to the territory for good, since Jane had no interest in St. Louis, and Daniel had discovered that he preferred Nevada to Missouri in every particular. He and Cecil began talking about expanding the cattle operation together, a partnership that Kate thought was excellent not just commercially, but for Cecil, who had been managing alone for a long time and had a brother who was worth having nearby. The town, by 1882, had stopped being a place that had tried to remove Kate Grayson and had become a place that was proud of its school. This transformation had been gradual enough that most of the people in it had not quite noticed it happening, which was perhaps the most honest kind of change, the kind that comes from daily behavior rather than declared intention. Harvey Bunch had built the schoolhouse a new set of front steps the previous autumn. James Ord had donated a case of books that his wife had ordered from a publishing company in New York. Alderman Prescott had, with some ceremony, hung a painted sign above the schoolhouse door that read Harlan Creek School, which Kate had accepted with genuine warmth, and the private thought that signs were less important than the learning that happened underneath them, but that the gesture was its own kind of apology, and she would take it as such. The summer of 1882 was warm and full and good. The cattle operation was profitable. The school would open in the fall with a planned enrollment of 30 children and the official recognition of the Territorial Education Board, which had designated it a Level II institution, a designation that meant real status and, more practically, additional funding for supplies. Kate had written 3 published letters to the Nevada State Journal on the topic of frontier education and the importance of educating girls with the same rigor as boys, which had generated correspondence from teachers in other parts of the territory, and one very firm letter from a man in Carson City who disagreed, which she had answered with equal firmness and considerably better evidence. Cecil had read all of these letters with the steady, attentive reading he brought to everything, and he had said, after the third one, that she ought to compile them into something larger, that they deserved a wider audience. She had said she had been thinking about that. He had said he thought she should do it. He said it in the way he said things he believed, plainly and without equivocation. And she thought, not for the first time, that being loved by someone who believed in the work you did was one of the great gifts a life could contain. On an August evening in 1882, Kate stood on the porch of what had been Cecil Hunter's house and was thoroughly hers, with Clara Margaret on her hip and William James running in circles in the yard the way 2.5-year-olds did when the evening was cool, and the world was very large and very interesting. And she watched the ridge go gold, and then amber, and then deep purple in the setting sun. And Cecil came out of the barn and walked across the yard, and lifted William off his feet in a single smooth motion that made the boy shriek with delight. And she thought about the Tuesday morning she had stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan Creek with a battered satchel and steady gray eyes and a considerable amount of stubbornness and no idea at all what was waiting for her. She thought about the bench outside the church and a tall man with direct dark eyes who had stopped and said, simply, "You are the school teacher." She thought about the council meeting and the rock shelf on the eastern ridge and the tomato garden and the crooked bell ringing on an October afternoon and the December mornings when 2 separate children had arrived in the room with the east-facing window. She thought about Frank Dole with his hat in his hands and Chen Wei, and Mei Ling's careful, beautiful writing, and William James saying small and Daniel Hunter laughing in the hallway and Mrs. Vargas with a rifle at the gate post, and a ring made of gold and turquoise that was the color of the morning sky. She thought about how a town had wanted her gone before nightfall, and a man had stood on his porch and said she was staying, and how that had not been the end of the story but only the place where the real one began. Cecil crossed the yard with William on his shoulders and stopped at the porch steps and looked up at her and said, "Supper," she said. "Mrs. Vargas made the good stew." He said, "She only makes the good stew when she thinks something ought to be celebrated." Kate said, "What does she think is being celebrated?" Cecil looked at her with those direct, familiar, beloved eyes, and he said, "I think she just thinks every Tuesday ought to be celebrated." She stepped down from the porch and took his free hand, and they went inside together, into the lamplight and the smell of stew, and the sound of a house that was full of people who were exactly where they wanted to be. And outside the eastern ridge stood dark against the last light, and the stars began their nightly arrival, and Harlan Creek, Nevada Territory, 1882, settled into its evening with the patient permanence of a place that had found, in the daily accumulation of small good things, something worth keeping. They had 2 more children, as it turned out. A second son named Thomas, born in 1884, who had the temperament of a diplomat and the appetite of 3 men, and who from infancy showed a facility for soothing difficult situations that his parents suspected was either a gift or a strategy. And a third daughter, born in 1887, whom they named Maria after Mrs. Vargas, who cried with an undignified thoroughness that she never quite forgave them for causing, and who became the child's fiercest guardian and most devoted admirer for the rest of her days. William James Hunter grew up to become, exactly as young James Cord had intended for himself, a man who did something important. He studied law in Carson City and eventually in San Francisco, and he came back to Nevada because he said the desert got into you and you did not get it back out, and he practiced law with the same directness and principle that his parents had shown him was possible. Clara Margaret Hunter, who had studied her father's ledgers and her mother's books with equal intensity, went east to study and came back with a degree and a husband who was also a teacher, and they settled on the edge of Harlan Creek and added their own chapter to what the town was becoming. Thomas and Maria were young when the century turned, and they grew up in a world that was already changing, the railroad closer now and the old frontier edges softening, though the desert itself was as permanent and enormous and beautiful as it had always been, and they knew it the way children know things they have grown up inside of, completely and without having to think about it. Mrs. Vargas lived to 78 and never left the small house on the property that had long since become entirely hers in every way that mattered. She was at every birth and every marriage and every significant meal and a considerable number of insignificant ones, and when she died, she was surrounded by 4 children and 7 grandchildren of the Hunter family, all of whom had been fed by her hands and judged by her eyes and found, in her estimation, to be acceptable, which from Carmen Vargas was the highest praise available. Daniel Hunter and Jane Ord Hunter built a house a half-mile from Cecil's property and ran cattle together with the Hunter brothers for the next 20 years, and the operation they built was the kind that became a landmark, not famous exactly but deeply established, the kind of thing that is simply part of a place. Cecil Hunter turned 50 in 1896, and Kate threw a party that embarrassed him and delighted everyone else, with the Ord family and the Bunch family and students who were now grown and had their own children, and came back to Harlan Creek for the occasion with the particular gratitude of people who knew that the woman who had taught them something that mattered. Kate stood beside him at that party and looked at the faces she had known for 18 years and thought about how a life that is built right is a thing that spreads in all directions, not like a monument but like roots, invisible most of the time, holding everything up. He found her at the edge of the gathering in the late evening, when the party had gone soft and warm around them, and he stood beside her the way he always had, close enough for their shoulders to touch, and he said, "Good party." She said, "You hated it," he said. "I did not hate it. I was uncomfortable for approximately the first 2 hours." She said, "And then?" He said, "And then I saw you talking to Mei Ling and her children, and I stopped being uncomfortable." Mei Ling had come from San Francisco, where she lived and taught school with the same care she had been taught, and she had brought her 2 daughters and her husband, and she and Kate had talked for an hour in the warm party light about children and schools, and the particular work of making a person believe they were capable of what they were actually capable of. Kate said, "She is extraordinary." Cecil said, "She had a good teacher." Kate said, "She had herself, I just gave her a room to do it in." He put his arm around her in the way that was so familiar by now it was part of how she understood the world, as reliable and essential as the ridge to the east and the smell of sage and the morning light. He said, "You have always been too modest about what you do," she said, "and you have always been exactly the right amount of proud of me." He said, "That is because I have been paying attention for 18 years. She said, "I know." The night was very clear, the way desert nights are when the air has some cold in it and the stars are very close, and the eastern ridge stood dark and familiar against the sky. And Harlan Creek was a town with 200 people now, and a proper railroad spur, and a brick schoolhouse with Kate Grayson Hunter's name on the dedication plaque above the door, because the territorial board had insisted, and she had relented because the children had wanted it. And children knowing that a person believed in their education enough to fight for it was worth having her name on a wall. She had come here with nothing but herself. She had found everything worth having. And the Tuesday morning she had stepped off the stagecoach, and the town had wanted her gone before nightfall, was 18 years ago and a whole life passed, and it was still the best Tuesday of her life. And she said so, aloud to Cecil, who laughed and said that the bar had been high. And she said yes, and he had cleared it easily, and he kissed her there in the clear desert night with the party winding down behind them and 4 children and 7 grandchildren in the world that they had made together. And the eastern ridge held its ancient watch, and the stars burned clear and countless and permanent overhead, and everything was as it should be.